Good evening and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Brenda Greene, and I am Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature, Director of the National Black Writers Conference, and Chair of the English Department here at Medgar Evers College. Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their lives, and their craft. We also are streaming the program on www.mecradio.com, www.mecradio.com. We're very excited that this is another added feature of our program. And I'm very, very pleased to have on the telephone with me this evening, Lalita Tademy. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
I can't believe it. You got it exactly right.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We're very, very excited to have you on the program talking about your most recent novel, Citizens Creek. And before we begin, I'd just like to share with our listening audience some background information about Lolita. Lalita Tademy is the New York Times bestselling author of 3 historical novels. Her debut novel, Cane River, was Oprah's summer book pick in 2001 and became San Francisco's One City, One Book in 2007. It was recently selected as assigned reading for all incoming freshmen at Stanford University. Her second novel, Red River, was released to critical acclaim in 2007, and her third novel, Citizens Creek, which is the one we will be talking about, was just published in November 2014. Lalita Tademy has been featured in People Magazine, O Magazine, More Magazine, Good Housekeeping, The Today Show, the National Book Festival. It just goes on and on. She also was a San Francisco Library laureate. And just to share the praise for this book, which I found fascinating, I'd just like to share with you what Ann Packer, the national best-selling author of The Dive from Clausen's Pier and Swim Back to Me, wrote. I think this really captures the book. The marvelous historical novelist Lalita Tademy brings her enormous gifts to the true story of a young slave sold to an Indian chief decades before the Civil War and the role he would play in setting the course of history. This is a powerful and moving novel about a little-known chapter in our past and about one family's legacy of courage. I'll remember it for a long time. And as I said, I think that really captures what this novel does for me. It gave so much background information and a chapter that so few people know about in our nation, in American history. So just some background, can you begin by telling us about your motivation for writing this book?
Well, I actually just became fascinated, riveted by a real-life character that I saw through a book, through a nonfiction book, and it was actually a biography of a family that lived in Oklahoma and had an oil dynasty. They really made a name for themselves in the early 1900s as oil brokers. But I was more interested in the ancestors of the man that founded that particular dynasty, his mother, whose name was Rose, and his great-grandfather, who tended cattle and was born a slave and bought his freedom and was an interpreter for a Creek tribe. I mean, all of these owned by a Creek Indian chief. None of these things seemed very typical to me, and they were all things that I did not know. I wasn't very aware of the fact that Indian tribes could own slaves, did own slaves. I wasn't very aware of the fact that there were families that really controlled pieces of oil that ran large ranches in Oklahoma. And so I was just fascinated by all the things I did not know. And because it takes me so very long to write my historical novels, because they're so research-based, they take between 3 and 4 years to write a piece. The subject matter has to be captivating, or I can't keep interested in the story myself, writing it, and therefore I can't take a reader to a place where they're interested in sticking with it. But this was so rich, and then based on real people, that I continued to be pulled forward into their world. And I have a little bit of a problem in getting out of the 1800s in my head. That's where I live a lot of my mental life, is recreating the 1800s and African Americans who lived during that time, who not only survived during that time, but found a way to thrive and to bring their families up with them and their communities up with them. And so, again, it was just pure fascination from beginning to end.
Right. I think about the indomitable spirit, as you said, of not only African Americans, but of Native Americans. And anytime someone wants to think about they're having a difficult life, they should just go back and read this book.
Right.
Because there is no comparison. The perseverance and the determination and what people went through was just really, really, as you said, riveting, and you really captured it. Talk to us a little bit more about what your research process was, because as you said, people who write historical novels really are both historians and also have to be good storytellers, so that you're not just recounting facts. You have to be a storyteller also. So what was that what did that research process involve, and how did you get your head situated in the 1800s?
So, because this is my third historical novel, I have acquired some skills, so it's a little less chaotic in trying to do this. But the very first thing that I do is I just make myself totally open as I can be, to absorb data, to absorb facts, to absorb information. And so I read everything I can get my hands on, both letters of the times, novels that take place during the period that I'm looking at, nonfiction books that talk about the people that lived there, that talk about the economy then, that talk about whatever the state is. I go through old newspapers. I read those. I interview people. I just have a huge influx of data. And then as a story starts to form in my head, I get more and more protective, and I narrow my scope more and more to just zero in on those things that help me to tell the story that's emerging, until by the end of that, I really don't want to hear anything else. I don't want any more data. I just need to then create my fictional world around that real data. And so it's really funny sometimes that I'm out, I'm soliciting information. I want to talk to anybody that lived in Oklahoma, that had relatives in Oklahoma, that had anything to do with the Creek Indians, and then people will say, hey, I found somebody for you to talk to, and I have to tell them, no, I'm not interested in talking to anybody anymore, because now it has started to live in my own brain.
That is something that many writers say they have difficulty doing, is knowing when to stop
Right.
and to
And
put that down. But you've managed to do that.
and it is very, very seductive to continue to do the research and to just keep getting that one more fact, that one more piece of information. Let me just go and look at this. And if you don't shut that down, or at least narrow it, you get stuck. And for me personally, the way that I do it is I just have to shut it down. I have to shut down all external voices, except for those that I am looking at for a very, very specific piece of research, such as what is it in 1837 that a Creek Indian slave would have eaten. And then I research that very, very specific thing, and I'll go back to the books for that. But in order to create an arc and a story, and I'm equally committed to writing a book where you are just determined to turn those pages as fast as you can to see what happens, as I am in being historically accurate.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about how you became a writer. And I imagine you're doing this full time now.
I do it full time, but I had a very long, two decades almost, career as a high-tech executive. So I had a very, very different life before. And I decided that I wanted to do something different. I had done that for quite a long time, running little businesses in big companies. And so I just quit my job. And this is quite a while ago now. It's almost 20 years ago. That's kind of staggering to even think about. But at any rate, I quit my job after a full career and not knowing what I was going to do. And I didn't quit it to write a book. I just quit because I thought there was another chapter for me. And I didn't know what it was, and I couldn't do it as long as I was working as hard as I was working. And when I did that, I got very interested in my own family genealogy, to the point where I was pursuing my own ancestors and found the bill of sale of my great-great-great-great-grandmother, who was sold in Louisiana in 1850 for $800. And when I found that, that's when I said, I need to write this. I need to write this and share this with other people.
The birth of Cane River, right?
Birth of Cane River. And it took me 3 years to actually write that book, and to turn it into not just genealogy and people's names and dates and places, but to turn it into a story with real characters that lived and breathed, that you would care about, and that you would want to continue to, you would want to live with as long as you were reading the book, and that you would remember long after you put the book down. And so I came to writing very, very late, and really because I had an amazing story to tell.
Right. And I imagine that some of the skills you used in your past professional life are the very ones that transferred and enabled you to really be so disciplined to sit down and write a book and do the research.
That is 100% true, but it was a double-edged sword for sure. The first book, the discipline part, I'm great on discipline. There's no question about that. And I will sit down every day, and as a matter of fact, did sit down every day. I never took a day off, 7 days a week, writing at least 3 hours a day, and hopefully more, for 9 months until I had a first draft of Cane River. But I also had to do it, I had to write that book by hand, because as soon as I sat down at a computer, my head went to a different place. My brain started to process things in a spreadsheet sort of way, in a business sort of way, in that discipline sort of way that really wasn't conducive to making up a story and to tell that story in what is often a sort of a circuitous way, which is how you get the thread of what you want to say down first before you start polishing it. And so the discipline helped me a great deal, certainly with the research, and it really blocked a lot in terms of the creativity of the writing process.
That's I can understand how that would happen. One of the questions I wanted to also ask was when you are sitting down, when you are narrowing down, when you have that focus. I know you're zeroing in on that literature that's going to help you write the story, but do you do any other reading? Are you reading other kinds of literature, fiction or nonfiction that's not related to your subject when you are writing?
Not much. And every writer is different.
Right.
For me, for sure, I cannot read anything that is close to what I'm writing about. And by close, I mean either subject matter or stylistically. I have to read something. I can't go without reading. That's just impossible. But it has to be something that's very, very, very different than anything that I'm doing. So I might be able to pick up a mystery and read that, or do some very light reading, or something close to even a romance novel kind of thing. But I can't read anything that can bleed over into the kinds of into the tale that I'm trying to do, or into the style in which I'm trying to write. And it's only in the breaks that I can then start reading again, or only when when I'm several drafts in. It takes me I've never written a book in less than 14 drafts, which means you're writing it from beginning to end that many times. Once I'm sort of 3 or 4 or 5 drafts in, I can start to read widely again. But while I am trying to really form the book, I cannot read very well. I just can't do it.
Wow, it's amazing. So let's talk a little bit more about the book and that relationship between, and I notice you use Indians versus Native Americans, or between Native Americans and blacks. Can you talk about that? And I found that fascinating. As you said, I did not know. There's so much I did not know. You hear snippets, but there's so much I did not know about what that relationship was like.
And so, yes, I'd love to talk about that. The first thing that I want to say, though, is that hopefully I'm not being offensive when I say Indian, and I know that that's not the politically correct term now, but in all of the research and everything that I did, certainly in the 1800s, Indian is what was used. And so because I write my books as if I am in that place, in that time, Native American didn't sound right. It didn't sound authentic as being, as having a point of view as being in the 1800s. So I say Indian, knowing full well that the politically correct term is Native American.
Yes, and I understand you saying that, but even in promoting it, the term has been Indian, I mean, Native Indian also. I definitely understand within that time period. But I'm not saying that to place a judgment on it. It's an observation.
Yes, no, and I didn't think that you were. It's just that I am sensitive to it, um, and made a decision that that is the way that I would talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the relationship between um, Indians of several tribes and blacks, it's different tribe by tribe. It's uh, uh, it is it is unique. I know that there are many folks in the black community who believe that they are descendants of Indians, that Indians are in their family tree somewhere.
As Europeans are.
I,
Yes.
I, yes, and I think that that is actually true less than people think, but more than some other people think. So that it's just very interesting. Now that people are doing these DNA swabs, 23andMe, they're actually trying to find their ancestral roots. Some of these, they've done some studies, and there was just something that was published in the New York Times that 1 in 5 African Americans has Indian blood, which is very interesting to just put a number to it. But Indians did own slaves in the 1800s. They did live side by side with blacks in the 1800s before the Civil War. And when the tribes were all removed, especially from the South, when the tribes were removed and they were really booted off of their own land and taken into Indian territory that ultimately became Oklahoma, they took their property with them, and their property included their slaves. So this was a relationship between the tribe that had full-blooded Indians, that had mixed, and that had some African slaves. And so out of that gumbo-like mixture, there were all sorts of scenarios of how blacks and Indians related to one another. And sometimes it was close and it was as family. In many cases with Seminoles, they were family. In other tribes, it was very strictly, there were plantations, and Indians treated their slaves exactly as the European whites treated their slaves. And in others, it was sort of a gray line where you weren't quite sure. So based on this real character, Cow Tom, who was owned by a Creek Indian chief, Cow Tom was actually a conduit between the U.S. government and the tribe. And he had such a pivotal position because the chief of the tribe didn't really speak English, and the U.S. government didn't really speak the Creek dialect, and so he was an interpreter. And as an interpreter, then he actually could rise in the tribe in importance and earn money doing this translation, buy himself out. He bought his family out. And so this was just such a remarkable juxtaposition of these two cultures. Again, that's really what pulled me into the story, is seeing how that evolved over time.
Right. Well, what I found interesting, and you said it, is the different scenarios, because there were some African Americans who viewed themselves as Indians. They saw themselves as Indians, and then you said there are others who they were more their property, but they classified themselves as Indians. And that whole one drop scenario, I've heard that referred to even in terms of blacks, that 1 in 5 blacks have white or European or mixed with white. So it's interesting that same parallel, that same equation is used to describe the percentage of blacks who are mixed with Indian, that 1 in 5.
Yeah, and I think that it's just that we don't think about it very much. But it makes sense if you go back and you look at history and you look at who's in proximity with whom, and you can see how it could happen. But I just don't think that we thought about it that much. But it's fascinating.
Right. And you also you talk about what happened in Oklahoma, but you also have quite a bit of history, the Trail of Tears and the forced taking of land throughout. I can't believe we're coming to a close. Can you just share with us what was the highlight or the most challenging in terms of writing Citizens Creek, and why do we need historical novels?
Oh dear. The most challenging part was really turning this into a story and not just a history lesson. And what I really wanted is I wanted someone to pick this up and just sort of almost race through it because they were so engaged in the story. And on the last page to realize how much more they knew about American history that they didn't know before they picked up the book, but they didn't feel as if I was forcing them to have a history lesson. So the hardest part was really turning this into a story and deciding which parts I could tell, because you just can't force all of it in there. And so all the things I had to leave out, I mourn, but you don't know what they are as a reader.
Right.
So that was very difficult to actually leave them out. And I think that history informs how we go forward. We've got to understand where we've been to know how to intelligently go forward so that we don't repeat the same mistakes, so that we understand what we need to do differently, or that we could have done things differently in the past, and we would be in a lot better position today if we had. And so that's my commitment to historical novels.
Well, I thank you so much, Lolita, for writing this book. As you said, you wanted it to be a book that you went through and then you realized how much you've learned. And I think you definitely have accomplished that. And for me, it makes me want to find out more about what this relationship was. So it is a really good starting point. And I think this is another book that needs to be required reading in our schools and our colleges. So I thank you for writing Citizens Creek.
Thank you so much. This has been fun.
Okay. And I just want to remind our listening audience that you should go out and ask for this new novel by Lalita Tademy, Citizens Creek. And I want to thank my engineer, Fritz Richardson, for being there. And remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. And kudos to Lalita Tademy for having the discipline, the vision, and the perseverance to write this really riveting novel. Thank you.
Next song was inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes. I'm sure most of you have heard of Langston Hughes. And he wrote a poem about rivers, and we call this song I've Known